Hills in the centre of Fife can be seen from much of the east coast of Scotland, stretching from the Lothians to Angus and Perthshire. Known as the Paps of Fife, the term pap referring to their clear resemblance to the female breast, they are a striking landmark and have been for millennia. The Lomonds have associations with archaeology, ritual and belief, folklore and history that go back thousands of years. Like many other similar places, they continue to have a hold on the communal imagination, and just as their basic shape survives in the landscape of modern Scotland, so too do echoes of some of the ideas and beliefs concerning them. They serve as a constant reminder that for many societies throughout the human story, the land was and still is sacred. Over millennia, beliefs may change, but the land abides. Places that long ago were special to people whose understanding of their world seems well beyond our ken have, in many cases, kept their importance to the communities around them. Ideas and beliefs in supernatural beings remain linked to such locales through stories, handed on to future generations orally. Many such stories started as myth, explanations of how the ever-changing and dangerous world we humans inhabit was made, and how it functioned through the seasons and from day to day. The telling of such stories educated the world's children long before writing was thought of, and as long as a story is relevant to the community who share it, we can be sure it will survive. Overlooking Loch Leven to the west of the Lomonds, Bishop Hill runs almost due south from the western part. The loch itself, like other notable Scottish lochs, is said to have originated in an overflowing well of destiny, in this case on one of the islands in the loch. And there, on the side of Bishop Hill, a story has survived, rooted in the landscape, that is still told hereabouts. Beside an old quarry, high on the side of the hill, there is a tall pillar of rock, not now as tall as once it was, but still having a distinct and striking appearance. According to tradition, this is Carlin Maggie, leader of a coven of witches who were active in the Lomond Hills in times gone by. It seems that Maggie, growing ever more powerful in casting spells and working magic, began to think she could take on the devil, Auld Horny himself. Now Auld Horny was never one to stand a challenge, and accordingly one night, when the witches had foregathered in their usual trysting spot, just above Glen Vale, the cleft between Bishop Hill and West Lomond Hill, he made his move. Swooping down through the air in the shape of a vast bat, with his arms full of rocks, he came, dropping his burden on the gathered coven below and killing them. As the rocks came crashing down on her sisters, Maggie turned to flee, but she didn't get far. She had only got a short way along the side of Bishop Hill when the devil threw a thunderbolt at the fleeing hag, turning her to stone where now she stands. The rocks which fell on the rest of the witches are known yet as the devil's burdens, and this part of the story may well be a Christian reworking of the much older motif of many of our mountains having been formed by the Kayach, or hag, dropping her lippen or apron full of rocks. The story of Carlin Maggie was used to frighten local children for years, but a closer look at the old dame suggests there is more to this tale than first meets the eye. Up to the present, most pictures of Maggie show her as a protuberant, even phallic column, but seen from the west she has a different aspect. From this angle her shape is very reminiscent of early European Venus figures. These images are thought to be representations of goddesses, and in Maggie herself perhaps we see the same. After all, her name Carlin is like the Gaelic Kayach, a name that hints back to a much more important figure than the hags and witches of more recent times. In tales recorded half a millennium ago, we know of the Carlin as a landscape maker, and many of the tales associated with witches are reminiscent of the Kayach in respect of her capacity to control the weather. In many such traditional tales, these Carlins and Kayachs are giant figures, shaping the landscape and controlling the weather, even, in some cases, having the power to restore life to the dead. What we are seeing are figures who once were goddesses. Maybe there just was one goddess, but the tales were told locally within the known environment of the audience. So every version of this great supernatural female has her own place, and this is Maggie's. Her environment may not be as lofty as those of the Kayaks of Ben Nevis, Ben Wyvis, or Ben Cruachan, a locale not so dramatic as that of the Kayak of the Corrie Vrecken, but the Lomonds have their own spirit and grandeur. The very name takes us back to ancient ritual, for the name Lomond comes from the old P Celtic Lumon, a beacon. These are fire hills, and it seems likely that here the great fires of communal feasts like Samhain and Beltane were lit to mark those significant times of the year. Such hilltops were long thought by historians and archaeologists to be forts, but we now know them to be much more sophisticated than just military stations. These were the places where communities gathered when they needed to come together for rituals, be it a feast or a funeral, the inauguration of a new chief or an important wedding. We cannot know how far back people used them, but consider this. If you see the world as being made, shaped and ruled by a primarily feminine force, particular shapes in the landscape, like these and other paps in different parts of Scotland, must have been made by her deliberately. Why else would she give them such a notable and fertile shape? Some such places like Schiehallion, Loch Nagar and Ben Cruachan may have rarely, if ever, been used this way, due to their inaccessibility and changeable weather. But that there was human activity on many of these paps is shown by the remains of ancient monuments on and around them. West Lomond has a cairn much smaller now than when it was first described in early 19th century, and on its southern slopes dozens of Stone Age artefacts have been found over the years. East Lomond Hill is topped by an enclosure with several banks, and a Pictish symbol stone of a bull was discovered here, as were two cup and ring marked rocks. The remnants of a variety of enclosures and hut circles have also been located around and between the paps. And from the Lomond Hills other similar places can be seen. North Berwick Law, like Arthur's Seat, one of the paps of Lothian, and Tinto Hill, another fire hill to the southwest, Ben Lomond over to the west, Dundee Law to the northeast, and far to the north, Schiehallion, the mother mountain of them all. And all these places, standing proud of their immediate landscapes, were the focus of ritual and of legend. Stories, place names and ancient monuments can be found around many of these significantly shaped places, creating clusters of evidence of just how central they were to the world view of local populations in pre-Christian times. And some, like Schiehallion, which can be seen from as far away as the Lothians, over 70 miles to the southeast, were known over a very wide area. And as many of these were fire hills, we can imagine at the time of the great feasts, bonfires would be blazing on their tops, each seen by the others, linking the localised ritual across a much wider landscape. Stories, even myths and legends, can change over time. What is important to one age may be less to another. Heroes and heroines change, but the link to places of such ancient sanctity remains, and this is probably how it came about, that the paps of Fife were known in the Highlands of Perthshire as Wallace's Goals, and the hero himself, turned to a giant in the folk tales, would leap from one to the other. Deeper in the past, the wonder and relevance of this area may well have had a link to that great hero of the Celtic-speaking peoples who lived here, Arthur. Is there something of his name on Benarty? Intriguingly, given the paps and Maggie herself, there are those who see in the reclining human-like figure of Benarty Hill not a sleeping warrior, but a sleeping goddess. Her head to the west, and opposite her vulval area, there is a face in the landscape. Navity Hill, its name coming from its role as a nemeton or sacred grove in the times before the Christians came to walk these hills. And on Benarty itself we have Growick's Well, said to have been named for the much maligned King Macbeth's wife Gruach, whose very name stirs echoes of the powerful female spirits called Gruagachs, who, like the Carlins and Kayaks, harken back to old beliefs. And there are those who draw attention to the Scottish historian Fordun, who stated that before she married Macbeth, Gruach was wedded to King Duncan. Given that Macbeth came from the ancient Pictish power centre of the far north, this has echoes of the much discussed ideas of matrimony amongst the native Picts, many of whose symbols can be interpreted as reflecting an early belief in the underlying feminine force of creativity and all life. And when the Christians came, they saw advantage in using those places that people already held dear to preach the new way. Thus we have the early Chaldees site of St. Serph in Loch Leven itself, and up on the moor between the Lomonds there is a simple incised vesica Pisces and a cross inscribed on an altar-like heap of rocks, suggesting that the earliest Christians were keen to sanctify this place to their own god, just as earlier it had been sacred to the goddess. And much later other Christians came to the Lomond Hills, close to where Carl and Maggie and her sister witches were said to have gathered. For there, in Glenvale, when religious strife stalked the land as King and Commons fought over the role of bishops, great conventicles were held. Hundreds of people came to hear their preachers of choice, and it's tempting to think of ancient tales still circulating in the story told of the conventicle in 1674 when mounted soldiers attacked. 5 or 6 times they charged, volleys of shots were fired from pistols and carbines, but though bullets whistled through some people's hair and smashed into rocks around them, not a body was harmed. It is said that the people in the villages below saw a giant figure hovering over the assembled congregation in the form of a tall man of majestic mien, standing in the air in stately posture, with one leg advanced before the other, all the time the soldiers were shooting. Seeing their volleys had no effect, the soldiers retired. The observers below did not know of the soldiers' attack until told of it by the returning members of the congregation. That great figure has been called, by some, the Angel of the Lomons. The very shape of the landscape seems to hold on to some of the ancient beliefs that once were prevalent here, and just below the northeast shoulder of West Lomond is another remembrance of how fertility was a central part of the human experience. Here there is Maiden Bower, not the folly carved as a cave into the rock, but the natural hole in the stone which stresses the original name of Boar, not Bower. This was one of those sites where women came in hope of falling pregnant or looking for an easy birth. Here they would crawl 9 times through the natural hole in the stone, and it wasn't just women. As references to the old wife's lifts on Craigmarry Moor far to the west tell us, the hole in the rock there was not only used by women, but by men, and it would seem likely that this too happened here. And the old wife is just the kayak or carlin in another form. Back up on the plain between the Lomond Paps is Maiden Castle, clearly again an area of ritual import, as its locale makes no sense at all as a defensive structure. And the maiden and the carlin, like the kayak and bride, would appear to be aspects of the same being. Yet even as we can discern echoes of old belief in our own landscape, there is much to learn. Looking at Carl and Maggie from the west, it appears clear that the mound on the skyline above her is symmetrical, but from one direction only, and along that line sits a strangely named little hill, Papist Now. Nothing is now known of how the name came about, but there has been speculation that once there may have been an early chapel here. As we know already, the early monks used already sacred locales for the first churches wherever possible. It wasn't just official policy, it was eminently sensible. Places to which people had come since time immemorial were part of the fabric of their lives, individually and communally. And looking from Papist Now over Caroline and Maggie's head to the mound on the skyline above, on the morning of the spring equinox, this is where the sun rises. Such alignments were of great significance to our ancestors. And beyond Papist Now to the west, there are further echoes of ancient belief in the cluster of sites and names in the hills and glens to the north of the Yetsamuckert. Their stories may have faded into the mist of time, but the place name and sites of ancient sanctity show us that this whole area of Fife is steeped in the remnants of ancient belief. What seems clear is that the Lomond Hills, Lochleven and Benarty Hill have all been part of what we can consider a sacred landscape, and in today's world, where our precious environment seems to be becoming ever more fragile due to human behaviour, we can look back to a time when the land seems to have been not merely seen as having been created and populated by the goddess, but was almost seen as the goddess herself, and her stories live on. Tell me a story. The child seeks the world. The story is started before the first word. For the story was first told long, long ago, from so deep in time nobody could know. And now here together, sister and brother, we know that one story will lead on to another. From the beginning of time to the very last breath, the story is life and silence is death. The way we have lived, the roads we have come, the giving, the sharing, such things we have done. Someone to listen, someone to tell. The story will lead us, and everything's well. Grandmothers tell us, grandfathers too. This is the story, this tale's for you. Together we listen, together we hear. One voice is speaking to everyone's ear. Within our story all living is cast. Out of the story, the future, the past. So remember the story as the children find sleep, the story that came from that old place so deep, that time is past telling, and time is right here, as once was, as now is, and so shall time be. In telling the story, each of us cares. In hearing the story, all of us share.